Alrighty, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Subscribing to My Podcast. Because I have a new guest featured every week, it makes it very difficult to maintain consistent viewership. So if there's one thing that you can do to support me or the guest featured on the show, it's by interacting with my channel in every way that you can. You can always decide to unsubscribe later if you decide that you hate me or my show. With that plugging aside, enjoy my discussion with Professor Gregory Robson is a professor of philosophy over at Notre Dame. We met and recorded an episode last spring where we talked a lot about economics, and then at the end we talked a little bit about religion because those are his two specializations in philosophy. We, talked about discussing the other end of that, which is going to be a little bit more of the religious philosophy. And so here is the long-awaited part 2 so that we can talk about that stuff. But Gregory, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then tell some of the viewers some important things that they should know about you.
Thank you, Elijah. It's a pleasure to be on. Greg Robson. I'm an associate research professor in the Mendoza College of Business at Notre Dame. I'm trained, as Elijah said, primarily in philosophy. I do business ethics, technology ethics, and I'm very interested in religion and also in economics, as Elijah pointed out, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about economics on the other end, and then we talked a little bit about religion at the end, and so I kind of wanted to continue that conversation. I guess when we're talking about a religion, we're talking about generally Christianity, and then you would mention schools of Catholic thought. But I guess, where are your religious interests right now? I mean, when you're talking about religion, what religions are you researching? Why do these religions interest you? And then we can kind of start from there.
So I work primarily in Christian ethics, including as it applies to questions in regarding business and technology and political economy, which is the field that concerns really the use of political power as well as the allocation of resources within an economic system. So I've thought about various religions, including all of the major religions, but I really focus on Christian ethics, and I've mostly worked in Catholic thought.
Yeah, well, and you talk about religion in the way that it interacts with business, and then with politics. I guess I'm interested. We didn't really discuss this, but I feel like today the conversation around the idea of Christian nationalism or Christian in regards to politics, and then how that bleeds into economics. I guess how do you describe the current state of, religion in our world, in our society, but specifically regarding politics or maybe economics? How do you describe today's interactions with those things?
Well, I think it's fair to say that, say in the West, generally Christianity has a very powerful influence on how people think about politics. But human societies are perhaps the most complex entities in the known universe. Think about the United States, as I mentioned, I think last time, around 340 million people. We all have different interests, preferences, beliefs, and on, values, needs, and so on. And then if you think about instead of the U.S. democracy, the world's oldest and largest democracy, where if you took away that population numerically, you'd still have over 1 billion people, namely India, you can see that there's a whole lot of complexity to consider there. So you asked about Christian nationalism in politics. I would draw a distinction between nationalism and patriotism, and then there are probably different subvariants of each, some better, some worse, depending on one's values and the assessment one does. But certainly I think our political beliefs need to be influenced by our values. There's no such thing as a view from nowhere where one has no values. But there also is such a thing as tolerance for different beliefs, and certainly that's a central part of Christianity and other religions as well. So I would think that a Christian who's interested in politics needn't think, for example, that we should use the coercive apparatus of the state to disallow any dissent and so on. That would be a mistake.
Yeah, well, and that's really interesting too. I guess one of the things you wanted to talk about and that I haven't had a ton of exposure to are the kind of the philosophy of the existence of God, or the arguments for the existence of God. You had kind of talked a little bit about it last time, but I guess if I were to press you on like how philosophy treats the existence of God. If you could give me a beginner's course into proving the existence of God, or at least talking about the existence of God, what, sparks in your head when I ask questions like that?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say, especially because I assume there are a lot of college students who are listening, the existence of God is talked about on college campuses very often as something that's kind of out of fashion. Certainly, there has been a wave of secularization, and many college professors who teach philosophy of religion themselves don't believe in God, and in fact, actively oppose really kind of a wholehearted consideration of the nature of God. That's the case for many professors, but there are many professors who are atheists who present, as they should, Christianity as well as they can, giving it the fairest characterization they can, and that's really a great thing. And Christians should do the same when they're presenting atheistic views, for example. So you might think that the world's, it's a really puzzling place. So you asked Elijah about kind of just ordinary thinking about philosophy of religion. Where do we start? What are some of the topics or main concerns? Here's one way to think about it, and I'll put it intentionally provocatively. So many philosophers of religion who are theists, they believe in God, have argued that it takes a lot of faith to be an atheist. Okay, not to say that it doesn't take faith to be a theist as well. But you might think that there are fundamental questions that go unanswered on atheism. So one is the start of the universe. Where did it all come from? We've got the Big Bang Theory. The universe is maybe 13.8 billion years ago. The Big Bang Theory, by the way, really started by a Christian. Got that big question. Where did everything come from? It seems like adverting to matter in an explanation, saying there was some material early on that started it, doesn't really explain it, because we need to explain, well, where did the matter come from? Or one might be satisfied with not explaining that, but then that really is mysterious. So that's one thing. The second thing is, where does consciousness come from, in a sense? How did it emerge in the history of animal life? So that's the second thing. There's various other questions. So you might think, in thinking about ethics, there's a big question, well, why should you be moral when nobody's looking? So Plato had the case of the ring of Gyges. Imagine you have a ring, it makes you invisible. You can do anything you want to. You can rob a bank, nobody will ever find out. Well, is it rational to say, no, that's wrong, and not do it? You can steal, you can do all sorts of things. You can kill an enemy, etc. Why not do that? Hume had a discussion of the sensible knave, and that's David Hume, the famous philosopher and political economist, very important thinker. Thomas Hobbes talked about the fool, where the fool acts unjustly when the fool won't be caught. There's this big question, well, why act justly, or more broadly, morally, when nobody's looking and you're sure you won't get caught and you're rationally sure of that? Christianity has an answer. Atheism, I don't think, does. What else? Oh, another consideration is the claim to miracles. And very briefly on that, Craig Keener has written a 300-page book called Miracles Today. It's Keener, Keener, Miracles Today. It's really a summary of a book that he wrote of over 1,000 pages, documenting various miracles where, you're on the operating table. There's a big medical problem. The surgeon says there's basically, a 1% chance that you'll make it or less, and suddenly, without surgery, you get better. Well, how do you explain that? Or somebody claims to have any of various other sorts of miracles in their lives, or think of all of the miracle claims in the Gospels. To be an atheist, you have to deny that every single miracle ever claimed in human history has happened. And that takes a lot of faith to feel that one's epistemically well positioned to deny all of the miracle claims throughout human history. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the considerations in philosophy of religion.
Yeah, and I feel like I've heard a lot of those before, and I think a lot of them are pretty compelling. I'm definitely most passionate against the ethics, the ethic part of that, but I want to talk about each of these one by one and give them the the proper skepticism, but also the proper push that I feel like they deserve. I guess the beginning. So you talked about where matter comes from, or the Big Bang Theory, the start of it all. I actually am unaware how did God come about, I guess, in religious circles. So I guess wouldn't the same problem exist for how God came to existence, or I guess how do we kind of get around that?
That's a good question that's been asked for a long time. Who made God, right? If God explains everything, well, who made God? Now, a lot of philosophers of religion will say, well, that presupposes that God was made. So if you go back to the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, in the 13th century, Aquinas, really a brilliant intellect, lived 49 years, wrote 8 million words, which is the equivalent of 1,000 articles in 49 years of life. So very impressive and very sophisticated work. Aquinas said that unlike us, where we exist because God made us, God gave us souls, even if our bodies evolved. God was not created, okay? So God exists necessarily. That's a feature of God. So any explanation for the existence of the universe, and this is really the hard part, has to eventually get to something that exists by its essence, so necessarily. Okay, so you can think of the infinitely hot and dense, say, matter, energy in the beginning of the universe. And you might think, well, wouldn't that be random if that just happened to exist necessarily or some such? And Aquinas would then say, well, okay, if that doesn't exist necessarily, what does? You might think, well, look, we don't need something that exists necessarily. We can just go on and on and on in the chain of explanation. Human beings to predecessors to non-living matter, back to the Big Bang. You just go on and on and on and on. Aquinas says, following Aristotle, that we can't do that, however, because then we'd have an actual infinity. But there's no such thing, they think, as an actual infinity. We can't have an infinite causal chain within the universe. And this really took on a lot of prominence when we surprisingly learned about the Big Bang. For a long time, the book of Genesis, discusses the start of the universe. And physicists, especially atheistic physicists, said, look, the universe didn't start. The universe has been existing all along, through like forever. It's eternal. And the Big Bang now radically changed that a little less than 100 years ago. And so there's this big question now. Well, okay, what started the Big Bang if something did? And if nothing did, then how do we arrive at anything like a satisfactory explanation for the universe?
Yeah, I guess is there a reason why the matter that created the Big Bang can't be a necessary cause?
There is, and it depends on partly on one's metaphysics. So metaphysics is the study really of the kind of the ultimate nature of reality. So for example, if you're in a physics class and the teacher says, all that there is matter in motion governed by the fundamental forces of physics, by, electromagnetism and the strong and weak nuclear force and gravity. And then there's maybe an explanation of dark matter, dark energy in there and so on. You might think, okay, that's interesting, but is that a claim within physics? And actually, think about it, it's a claim about physics. It's a claim about the universe, that all that there is that exists is matter. Now, you might think, in principle, it's possible that the matter at the start of the universe existed necessarily. But at least if you follow Aristotle and Aquinas, they think of matter as having potency, okay? And it's really a composite. It's not fully actual, okay? So Aristotle brings in some kind of quasi-technical jargon, and Aquinas follows him on this. The idea is that we can potentially, as n-mattered beings, we have skin, the flesh, bones, etc. We have matter. We can be different things. We can have, a baby can get taller. People can change the size of their body and their strength and things like that. So we have some potency in us. But it's not clear that someone can exist by one's essence and yet still have potential in the right kinds of ways. And let me just really home in on that for a moment. So Again, Aquinas thinks that God exists by God's essence, that it's part of God's nature as a necessary being. In one of my articles, I say God is one of the strongly necessary beings, so an uncreated necessary being. Okay, it's part of God's nature to exist necessarily, essentially. It's not part of our nature to exist essentially. So if our parents didn't have us, we wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be here talking about this. We're contingent beings. So Aquinas says that we need to trace kind of the chain of contingency, going across the causal chain, getting back eventually to a necessary being. And I suppose, I mean, sure, one could say it's matter at the start of the Big Bang, but what an unusual universe it would be to have some matter that suddenly, eventually made it possible for human beings, for example, to come to exist when the odds of that ex ante were, less than 1 in a trillion. Okay, so the odds of our being here are less than 1 in a trillion given the laws of physics, and yet here we are, interestingly enough. If it were just some matter that happened to exist necessarily, somehow, that doesn't seem like a satisfying explanation. God might be a more satisfying explanation, even if there are, of course, still mysteries, as Aquinas himself would acknowledge.
Yeah, and I think that'll transition because I think the next part of this argument is going to have to be something about the idea of infinite, or at least long periods of time, combined with the concept of evolution. I think the next skepticism that you had with the atheist point of view was with consciousness and how that developed. I know that the chief reason as to why they would pin it on consciousness is probably going to be some sort of evolutionary development, as in like we started as a bacteria, we evolved to fit, whatever the evolution chain, and we developed a more sophisticated consciousness to solve a higher set of sophisticated problems. I guess, what is your reaction to this in the modern way people are viewing that consciousness developed?
Yeah, I think it's certainly the case, first of all, that minds and brains are very closely connected. So if someone goes into one of our brains and fiddles around, we're going to have serious mental effects that will be obvious to all who can observe, okay? So that's the case, and it's also the case, secondly, that we adapt. We adapt to particular ecological niches. We adapt as a species. The survivors who have genes fit for survival will pass those genes on, and people who don't survive will be less likely to pass their genes on. And that all makes perfect sense. Nevertheless, there are still major puzzles about the existence of consciousness. You can think of Frank Jackson's case of Mary, Elijah, which you may have studied this and be interested in it. So Mary's a scientist. She knows all of the facts of physics. She lives in a black and white room. She's studied every single book of physics. In fact, she's studied every book of physics, let's say, ever written. Then she leaves the black and white room with this great knowledge. She's the greatest scientist of all time, let's say. She leaves the room, and then she sees a red rose. Question is, does Mary learn something new? So what do you think about that? Let me ask you just to probe you a bit. What do you think?
I've been presented with this problem once. I can't say I've put a ton of thought into it. Does Mary learn something new? Yeah, this gets into this really interesting conversation, I feel, about perception and what perception teaches you. My instinct is that you're assuming that within the physics book she read how color works and how it reflects and interacts with your optics and does these things, but she's never actually experienced color. Is this the idea, or is it more so she's never even heard of color and then she sees it?
Oh, she knows everything that's ever been written about color. That's true. The wavelengths of different colors, how eyes work, connections between physical objects and eyes. Everything that anyone who's ever studied color as a scientist and written down or even just learned, she knows that. And yet there's the question, does she learn something new when she first sees the color red, or any color that's not anything that's not black and white, let's say?
I would say yes. I would say something new is unlocked from that experience. Now, whether or not it is the full journey of experiencing color, I'm a little skeptical of, but yeah, I do think something new has been unlocked. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably true also. And you're in good company. A great number of philosophers of mind and neuroscientists think the same. There are big debates, of course, about it.
Right.
But it seems like there are things to know about the universe that are not explainable strictly and purely in scientific terms. And so you might think that consciousness is, wow, isn't that remarkable? Because think about all of the colors we see right now. Think about all of our sensory experiences. There's so much to explain that physics, for example, doesn't seem to explain. Biology doesn't seem to explain. Chemistry doesn't seem to explain. So there's the real question about that. And then there are also questions about things like different functionalities that human beings have that it doesn't seem evolution was especially fitted to select for. So, for example, the capacity to do theoretical physics. I mean, maybe in principle, and I'm open to this, maybe in principle that can have survival, confer survival benefits and adaptive advantages. But that's at least an open question whether an evolutionary account is the full explanation.
Yeah, I guess the way that I think about it is that we we're kind of it's kind of it extrapolates on itself in that you are creating these survival things. So like the idea of consciousness is like, it would be really nice if I were able to think of things that I cannot currently see or experience so that I can predict future animal attacks, future places that might exist. Exploratory, it's kind of like a motivating thing. And then that allows you to build a society in which you are able to research metaphysics or these more complicated things. So I don't know if it's necessarily direct biological evolution that allowed us to do that. I think that that's more of like a societal evolution that gave us the opportunity to research those things. And so it's like a kind of different sect of evolution, not necessarily like a strictly biological evolution, but more so like an evolution of like heritage, like getting put down, or an evolution of society that opens the gates for different kinds of thought or different kinds of research. But the idea of consciousness is still a mystery. I guess you can track, though. You might not be able to track evolutionarily how exactly the brain developed to allow for this consciousness, as in like even now you can't think of something in your brain and then locate exactly where that thing exists in your brain. However, I feel like you can track evolutionarily why we would want to develop a consciousness or the applicable benefits of developing a consciousness. But I agree with you, how that came about or like how exactly that worked or even what the steps, I think, are a complete mystery. And I agree with you on that.
Yeah, so you might think, I mean, I suppose we can think about alternative possible worlds as philosophers are wont to discuss. Another world, perhaps quite distant from our own, is a world in which human beings are not conscious. We're more like robots, and we just navigate the world and we change the gene pool, but we don't do it with any sort of consciousness that's recognizable to us today or any consciousness at all, perhaps. And so there's a question like, uh, why aren't we like that instead? I do think there are benefits to having consciousness overall. I think that you can make very strong arguments to that effect. So the puzzle, and I think we agree here, Elijah, the puzzle seems really to lie in the question, why this consciousness? Why the consciousness that we have with all of its interesting functionality and with cases like the Mary case and other questions that are really hard to explain on a purely materialistic metaphysics. And I'd note also, by the way, that social and cultural evolution are compatible with very different kinds of metaphysics. So materialistic metaphysics or metaphysics where there are some things in the universe, maybe consciousness, minds generally, maybe numbers, for example, things we do in mathematics, maybe the laws of physics themselves in some sense, and that's a different conversation. But maybe there are various things that are immaterial, and that if so, then that kind of opens the door a bit, I would say, to religious explanations of the universe.
Yeah, and all of that makes sense. I think the mysteries of the world really point to some sort of answer that I guess is outside of things that we can understand. Now, the one that I think I will argue with you the most is going to be this societal one about what justifications do you have for acting in a just way or a moral way? I guess I wonder, to me, my general thesis is that without the existence of God, the world would align in relatively the same way. In that, like, the rules of life are kind of bounded by nature, kind of bounded by how our brains work, and kind of bounded what is best for society. So every action you can take, if you were to extrapolate it to the mass of people, it would kind of illustrate to you that some actions just cannot coexist with an existence of society. The easiest example of this is going to be murder, in that, like, if everybody wanted to murder the people that you want to murder, society would cease to exist. But then you can kind of get into this efficiency argument, and that, like, lying doesn't operate in kind of the same way. But if everybody were to be allowed to lie, society would operate at a slower pace than what we would like. So that's why it is wrong to lie. But you can even isolate that down to an individual's preference, and that lying is bad for you because you kind of want this mutually assured trust that people aren't lying to you and you should represent that. But if you really want to get down into it, and this gets into the example of the ring, of the invisibility ring, and if you really get down to it, it seems like there is this universal rule that happens when the natural consequence of lying, for instance, is going to put you in this weird position where you haven't worked enough to get the things that you want and you have lied. And so the consequences of this are going to naturally fall upon you, in that lying prevents you from working hard enough. So now when presented with an environmental challenge that you can't necessarily control, you are not well equipped to deal with that because you haven't built up the, perseverance to not lie. You haven't been honest with yourself. And so now you're presented with this circumstance in which hard work is required to overcome it. You haven't worked hard. You've lied your whole life. You're going to be less equipped to handle this kind of challenge, which would kind of be this universal or natural challenge against individuals acting in this way. I guess, to me, it feels like if it was somehow proven to everybody that God doesn't exist, if your morals change, I begin to question how real or authentic those morals were. So I guess I said a lot of stuff, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts on this are, or what you can kind of pick apart.
Yeah, those are really interesting points, and I think there's a lot to be said. So I'll speak to some of them. You raised the nice Kantian point that, like, look, if we have a system of truth telling, that's good for all. But if we have a system in which people are free selectively to lie when it suits their interest, then the whole institution of truth telling breaks down, because you don't know who's lying and who's not lying. You can't tell the dupes from the genuine truth tellers and so on. So how can we trust one another? Now, I would say there are a number of things to say. One is the big question of the Ring of Gyges, Hobbes's fool and Hume's sensible knave is, well, is it rational for you to lie when you know you would benefit from it, and you know nobody, and relatedly perhaps, you know nobody would find out? From a Christian standpoint, it's pretty easy to respond to that, because not only is it not the case that nobody would find out, but in fact, God would know. And in the end, God does justice to all of us, given our actions. And so if we lie, God will know it and will be judged, and we know that. So that's a great deterrent. That deterrent is not there, at least not as much, if you remove God, as it were, from the picture, where God's not one being among beings to kind of just take out and move to the side, but God's more like the ground of all being, in whose life we, in a sense, we participate. So Aquinas discusses the natural law and how we can use natural reason without revelation to understand a great deal about morality. And you might think something like this: why don't we take a secular natural law approach? There are things we know that are good for societies. People shouldn't steal, people should respect property ownership, relatedly, people shouldn't kill, shouldn't lie, and on and on. And we know that without those things being respected, without people adhering to those principles, societies would be much worse off. Okay, fair enough, that's true. But that's a point about societies themselves. It's not a point about the rationality of a particular individual within a society deciding whether or not to lie. I have to say, Nietzsche is pretty powerful on these kinds of arguments. So Nietzsche says, look, if he said, God is dead and we've killed God, and Nietzsche, people often don't realize this. Nietzsche lamented that fact. He thought that the conditions of civilization, in a sense, weren't amenable to belief in God. And Nietzsche then thought, well, the thing to do then is to rid ourselves of this slave morality, this unusual Christian stuff, where there's this poor guy, Jesus. C.S. Lewis said he was the Lord, as he claimed, a liar or a lunatic. He wasn't a liar or a lunatic, so he must have been the Lord. Nietzsche says, that was just, like Nietzsche said, Christ was the only Christian who ever lived. Christianity, in fact, isn't true because there is no God. And so what should we do? Well, we should pursue basically worldly goods. We should try to maximize our power. We should try to follow the example of Napoleon, for instance, one of Nietzsche's supermen, or the overman, as he puts it, the Übermensch. And so Nietzsche, at least, and you might disagree, but he thought that once you lose Christianity, you lose a great deal in terms of understanding the rationality of being moral and understanding what it looks like to lead a good life. There's a huge debate here. I just want to be clear. There's a huge debate. I have many very sophisticated atheistic friends who have a whole lot to say on this. I disagree with them, but it's collegial disagreement. But I do think if you lose Christian values and if you lose that motivation to do God's will, then your incentive rationally to tell the truth in every single case throughout your life, or never to steal, or never to, whatever it might be, that drops down. Your incentive weakens. And I think Nietzsche was right on target about that.
Yeah, well, and I absolutely agree with that, in that God is an excellent deterrent. And I guess my idea is that unrelated to God's existence, these moral rules exist. It's just that God does a wonderful job of effectively communicating these, effectively deterring these, and effectively teaching people these morals as well. So I would never lie down on the effectiveness of these things, and to take out religion would have irreparable damage to how we understand morals and ethics. I guess my point, though, is that I don't think God is a necessary condition for these morals. I think they have in that, like, on an individual level, I don't know if you can take society out of individual decisions. I don't know if you can take these things out. I'm assuming you're aware of the prisoner's dilemma, where you and another person are getting interrogated, and then if both of you rat out the other people, both of you go to jail. But if only one of you does it, the person gets free and the other person goes to jail. There's a rational incentive there for you to lie, but when extrapolated out multiple times, or what you would wish the other person would do, it actually becomes rational for you to tell the truth, even though your percentages of going to, getting free lessen. It's kind of one of those things where it's like the moral truth, it's a very loaded term, but of acting morally is going to be beneficial for you, even if God doesn't exist. And I'll bring it back to the kind of point that I feel like I ended it last time with. If it was proven that God doesn't exist, I think it would be morally questionable if your morals changed. Now, your propensity to actually follow those moral rules would probably change. But if you were to change the way you act substantially because God doesn't exist, I would begin to question how moral your values actually are. And I guess I wonder if you have any thoughts on that point, with on whether or not your morals are moral in the way that we would want them to be if they instantly fail when God doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think one's moral views depend on one's views of the universe and their role in the universe. And so, if God exists, that certainly has a great deal of importance for how one thinks about how one ought to live, the character one ought to develop, the kinds of relationships one ought to have, the behaviors one ought to do and refrain from doing, and so on. So I think that's quite right. Now, you're certainly right that in the prisoner's dilemma, the dominant strategy is defection, and if it's a one-shot dilemma, but if it's an iterative game where people rely and know they rely on one another for cooperation over many different events, it does pay to be a truth teller and to be known to be a truth teller. That's the case, but even there are situations where you can easily imagine scenarios where you could lie or steal and it would benefit you, and you just break the rules once here, once there, and so on. And if, the question is, well, is it rational for you to do that? Well, if God will know that, and if you want to live for God, if you're wholeheartedly invested, then it's a good idea not to do that. Partly because it shapes your character. You develop dispositions then to lie or cheat or steal, etc. Um, but if you think nobody will ever know, then why not lie or cheat or steal, right?
Yeah, well,
So yeah, I think world matter a great deal, and I think I would be shocked really if somebody's worldview changed dramatically and their moral views didn't change substantially at all.
yeah, I guess when I think of it in that context, I'm mostly referring to morals in the way that you would want morals to be, because I'm in a very weird position, and I find myself defending against both Christians and atheists in this. But the way I position myself is that there should be a logical defense, completely unrelated to your religion, as to each rule that your religion teaches you. Otherwise, you fall into the category that you denounce every other religion for being in. And so, like, the problem is that, like, you would look at people who worship other gods and you say, like, look how foolish they are for worshiping the wrong God. But they're in the exact same boat as you. And I feel like the distinguishing factor between that has to be the logical adherence or correctness of the views that your religion has. So to me, Christian values do a incredible job of mapping onto what I would consider the logical values that people should have. It's almost a one-to-one in that, like, the way the Bible describes how people should live is very accurate, even if God doesn't exist. Whereas other religions, I don't feel as strongly about that. And to me, I'm able to distinguish which religion I should follow or which religion is logically accurate because of this distinction. And when you don't have that kind of, I guess, backup, or you don't have that kind of view on your morals, I begin to question how safe you are in believing that religion or how true that religion ends up being. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at with your moral shouldn't change. If you are following a moral only because God is telling you to, or because of this fear of hell or this want of heaven, I feel like that kind of takes out what it is to be moral, as opposed to following it because it's the right thing to do, if that makes sense. That's the kind of distinction that I'm trying to make. And I feel like religion, especially Christianity, does a wonderful job of doing this. But I dislike the necessity of it, in that, like, morals can't exist if God doesn't exist or something like that. Other than maybe the origin of it, maybe God created nature to reflect these morals. That I wouldn't object, but whether or not God has to continue to exist for these morals to exist, I'm definitely skeptical of.
Yeah, and that's a common skepticism. So, Aquinas will say that God is inherently good. That's part of God's character. God's necessarily good. God couldn't start, for example, torturing people just for no good reason, something like that. Um, so, there's a lot to consider. Thousands of pages have been written by Christians on every single one of the Ten Commandments, on every main part of natural law, which is basically you can think of as morality in the sense that it's a morality that exists and comes from God and is discovered, not merely constructed, although it can be adapted to particular cultures, particular times and places. But yeah, and there's a whole lot to say. One thing to consider, think of a book by Jeremy Waldron on God, Locke, and equality. Many of our fundamental ideas, including the very basic idea of human equality that undergirds the system of Western nation states, that's been around since the Peace of Westphalia, at least 1648, I want to say, maybe 46. I think it's 48. There's this idea, look, we're all equals. But that idea is not an idea, so far as I know, that people had, say, in the Pleistocene 150,000 years ago. It would be unusual, wouldn't it, if you lived in one group and another group you've never met lived elsewhere, and then for the first time in the entire history of your community, you went to see that group, and they had very different practices. You might think that they were inferior to you. You might think that they were superior, but it'd be unusual, perhaps, to think that you're fundamentally each other's equals. Well, the Judeo-Christian tradition really ushered in the idea in philosophy, and also that undergirds our political systems, that human beings are each other's basic equals. And there are many other, in a sense, innovations that Judeo-Christianity brought about. One other brief point, you mentioned different religions. A whole lot depends on your view on the life of Christ, whether Christ was who he said he was. I mean, he said the code word. He said, "I am," and everybody knew that he was claiming to be divine. Everybody knew that people were reporting miracles. Everybody knew that that's why he was crucified. He claimed to be God. He claimed to be God incarnate and to fulfill prophecy. So there's a real question how to reason that out. On the Catholic tradition, and this is one part I like about it a whole lot, is they're very heavy on the reason part of faith and reason. It's not like you've got your faith over here, believe whatever you'd like. It can be totally irrational, and then we can reason and do science and so on over here. Big mistake. Okay, the very enterprise of science itself depends upon, to mention one other Christian contribution, the idea that the universe itself is intelligible. Again, that's not something that was there, so far as I know anyway, say 50,000 years ago. The idea that in principle, using this 2 to 3 pound lump of gray matter between our ears, we can look out into this vast cosmos, and in principle, we can understand a great deal of it, maybe all of it. That's a real shocker, but that's no surprise at all in the Christian view.
Yeah, well, and I completely agree with that. I think that's why I end up defending so much of the Christian ethics and Christian morals, because, like I said, I feel like it does a really good job of latching on to, I guess, what you describe as the natural law. And I guess the great human mystery is why we don't always conform to this natural law, or why we imagine that we would be better if not. But I guess even Christians sin, and even Christians struggle with conforming to what is best for them or what they should do, even in the face of God, because that's some mystery of human nature, I guess, is that people are going to, walk outside of God. And I guess the origin of this is, I guess, a little bit less important to me than the current state we are in, having to deal with the consequences of these morals and of these ethics. Like, as in, we need to be moral or ethic. That's kind of the position we're in. And so I guess the origin of it is important, but less important to me than the values I would describe. So, but I agree with you that I feel like so much of the world was saved with these values being described, not only in the context, but being fought for, being valued. And I think that was a world-changing thing. I guess one of the last points that you brought up was the idea of miracles. And I know that a lot of people are skeptical that miracles, especially in the way that they're described in the texts, happen today. Can you kind of educate some of the audience on, the miracles that are happening today, what they look like, the documentation of these things? Because I feel like a lot of people don't believe that miracles are still happening, I guess, in the conventional sense that they used to happen.
Well, let me go back to an earlier point just for a moment, and then I could say a bit about miracles. So, one of the points, Elijah, you mentioned, which was a really good point that I failed to address, was this question of, like, is it rational, or should we want God to exist if people then will just try to avoid the pain of hell and try to get into heaven, right? And I think it's important to note. So think if you've ever had this happen in your life, I have with the deaths of my brother and father and others. Think of the death of a loved one. It's very painful. There's a painful separation, or the loss of say a divorce, for example, or the loss of a close friend, maybe your best friends, and then you're no longer friends. That can be painful for sure. Well, hell on the Christian idea is a very painful chosen separation, freely chosen separation from God. So hell is a place on traditional Christian thinking. Hell is a place. There's a question whether it's populated, but the idea is that it's a chosen separation. So just like you'd love to be in good relations with your father, mother, brother, sister, best friends, spouse, etc., children, etc., if you have children, you want to be, and even more so, in a good relationship with God. And you want to do that for its own sake. And that's really that's the call to holiness. That's the point of the Christian life. Yes, you also want to avoid hell, but that's because you want to avoid that painful separation. And then, of course, we can get into other questions like should Pol Pot or Genghis Khan or Hitler or Stalin or others be in hell and so on. But that's one point I wanted to mention. Think about leading the good life, understood Christianly, as a life in relationship with God, not just to check off some boxes saying, well, I didn't steal, I didn't cheat, I didn't lie, but to really say, I gave my life for God in service to God and all. I tried to love God with all of my heart and my neighbor as well. So that's that point. Now, you asked about miracles. On that, I would say, first of all, there's a big disincentive to share miracles. Of course, if somebody starts saying on the street corner or on a podcast or wherever it might be that miracles have happened, that naturally invites skepticism. Oh, come on, miracles happened. What about science? Or I don't believe you. Or Hume had a great argument, the strongest argument ever against miracles, which I think was mistaken. But he says we always have more evidence that the laws of nature will not be set aside, and a miracle just is a violation of the laws of nature. So we always have more evidence that a miracle didn't happen than that it did. But think about the following case, okay? And remember I said earlier, to believe in God, all you need to know, to believe in a divine being at least, all you need to know is that one miracle of the probably millions of miracles claimed in human history has happened. And to disbelieve rationally, you need to be confident that you know that none of those miracles ever has happened, say, over the last couple 100,000 years in human history, and no miracle for all of the future of humanity will happen. All right, so here's a case. Suppose you're Elijah, not you, and I don't know your personal situation, but suppose one's mother, say, is an atheist, spends her entire life as an atheist up until age, say, 50. For 25 years, she devotes her life to atheist causes, and she does so wholeheartedly, like many friends of mine with great intentions. I have different views, but they really want to improve the world, and so she does all she can to advance the cause of atheism. She donates accordingly and on and on. And then one day, say it's your mother, she says to you, I had a religious experience. And you say, well, hang on, what? You had a religious experience? Is this my mother talking, right? And she says, yeah, I had a religious experience, and God made clear to me that God exists. And you say, wait, hang on a minute, is that so? And then you talk to your father maybe, and say, did you hear this thing about mom? This isn't my mother, is it? And you think, do I have good reason to believe what she's saying? Do I have good reason to believe her testimony? Is she a reliable testifier? And your father says, yeah, she told me immediately afterwards. She had a religious experience. She said it was a miracle. And it doesn't matter what the details are. It could have been a healing. It could have been she had a certain feeling that was more vivid than anything she's ever experienced in her life by far. It could have been various other things. The question is, do you have good reason to believe your mother? Or should you say, no, Hume was right. Your mother, she's apparently totally deceived or lying. And I would say, in that case, there's pretty good reason to believe one's mother if indeed one's mother has been truthful and caring and so on her entire life so far as one can tell. So miracles take a certain shape, and there are many different kinds of miracles. But I would just recommend reading Craig Keener's book, again, Miracles Today. Really a fabulous book. Not all of the miracles are as plausible as others, but certainly there are plausible miracle reports in that book. And if one's an atheist, start reasoning it out and thinking about who to talk to and who to discuss miracles with. Find the people who disagree with you and wholeheartedly search them out.
Yeah, well, and that makes sense too. There's a really interesting idea of, I guess, just the amount of time has passed and the amount of interactions have been iterated so many times that statistical probabilities kind of become more real. Like people will point out that you might put a load of laundry into the dryer and then you open it and it is all perfectly folded. Statistically, this is possible. Now, applicably, it is impossible. But I wonder if the world were to exist for as long as it has, and laundry machines were to exist for as long as it has, if the reality of the laundry being folded in that way becomes realer and realer, just as time would pass. And I wonder, with the example of your atheist mother, I wonder if it's also possible that just religion hit her in a way that seemed like it would benefit her life. Like, as in, she should live a life as the Bible would describe it, unrelated to, whether God, it was a religious experience. More so, it was an awakening that she's living her life in a way that isn't influencing her in a way that she would like. It's just not being beneficial. Whereas a lot of Christians are generally happier. They experience all of these things, and maybe the reality of that had set in. Maybe it wasn't a miracle. It was just, at the beginning of her life, it was incredibly unlikely that she would discover that her decisions are causing this kind of mental uncomfortability or preventing her from experiencing this amount of happiness. And then now she's 50 and she's like, crap, I haven't been truly happy or fulfilled or have had purpose for so long. And then that's what awakens the religious experience. To me, it seems like miracles in that aren't, biblical, like the one, like Noah, building the ark, or, Moses parting the Red Sea, or a lot of these things, seem like statistical probabilities increasing as time would go on. I guess there are examples that would obviously not fit within that paradigm, but I guess I just wonder if there's a reason why that can't be the case.
Yeah, I think it absolutely can. So um, it would be surprising, I suppose, if there weren't ever big surprises. Because if you just think about statistics, anomalous things do indeed happen and they will happen. And sometimes they might manifest in such a way that they seem like a miracle when in fact maybe they weren't a miracle. Um, but then, you can think of various cases. So for a big question there, first of all, is, well, okay, how many of those do you expect to happen? If you talk to everybody you know, so go ask a dozen friends whether anyone they know has ever experienced a miracle or reported having experienced one. I'm pretty sure there's a good chance, depending on the circles one runs in and so on, there's a good chance that somebody will have claimed that at least. Uh, in any case, Keener and many others argue that there are many, many miracles today. In fact, there are miracles, perhaps even on a level with some of like the frequency of miracles in the gospel accounts. That's a big claim. I'm not going to defend it here. But think about, St. Paul on the road to Damascus. Here's a guy, a genius, who was going around killing Christians. And then all of a sudden he has a religious experience, falls to his knees. A few days later, he becomes a Christian and becomes maybe the biggest converter of people in human history. Was that a real miracle? Well, he certainly believed it was. Think about, I mean, there are many examples, and you can look at, think of I don't know, Pascal, Newton, Copernicus, Leibniz, Aquinas, Aristotle and Plato, who were theists, and many others. And, look at the whole corpus of theistic literature of the best thinkers ever, and those are certainly some of them, and see what they say about miracles and religious experience. But think of Aquinas, for example, okay? Again, Aquinas, in my view, top five philosopher, I would think in at least the history of Western philosophy, at least top 10, and maybe he's better than a top five philosopher. There's a lot to be said. Peter Kraft had him ranked even higher than that. But in any case, Aquinas writes the Summa Theologia, writes again the equivalent of 1,000 articles in his lifetime. He's the most influential thinker over about 1,000-year period that's often mistakenly called the Dark Ages, but is better called, or the Middle Ages, but is better called the medieval era. And then at the end of his life, Aquinas has what you might think of as a foretaste of heaven. He says he falls to, in my understanding of it, he has this big experience, and he says, everything I've written is as straw compared with what I've seen. So think about that. Imagine the smartest person and best intellectual alive today, whoever you think of. And then suppose they tell you, what I've done is nothing compared to with what I've seen. Not that what he did was not true, but it's like it's the kind of idea where, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? And Aquinas is saying what he wrote, which was ingenious, and people would follow him around and try to understand him and work with him, and we've been reading him ever since. He says, yeah, that might be fine, but it's nothing compared with getting a glimpse of God's kingdom. We can ask, well, was that a plausible miracle report? There's no reason I can think of to deny it.
Yeah. Do we? I believe we're running out of time. As in, you have to leave at 11:30. Still correct?
Yeah, 5 or 10 minutes or so we could go on for.
Yeah, no problem. I will wrap this up. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of end the episode out and round it out. If you were to, summarize some of the points, some of the important distinctions that you're making, this is kind of your opportunity to round the episode out. And then, people who have made it this far into the episode, if you have messages for them, this is really your opportunity to just, end the episode.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Elijah, for having me, and I'm happy to always to talk with you, and thank you all for listening. So there are a number of things I'd like to briefly summarize, but also let me say a bit about things I haven't mentioned yet. So it's very important to keep in mind in Christian thought that the human beings are special. If you look out the window and you see a bicycle and a person and some grass and a roof, immediately you should think person. That's different in kind from everything else. A person is a who, not a what. Okay. So persons on the Christian view are made in the image and likeness of God. What does that mean? It means that unlike every other living being, we have a special capacity for reasoning and coming to know God. Other beings are rational in limited ways, but we alone, for example, well, we make iPhones, we make the internet, we go to the moon, we have a Shakespeare, for example, and on and on. So human beings are special, and we have, because of how special we are, we have a special dignity, and that really grounds a whole lot of Western thinking. So a mainstay of Western ethical thought is that human beings are to be respected as ends in themselves, to put it in Kantian language, never merely as means. People should be not used as objects, but always treated as subjects. We're persons, not things. And I think that's rather important. So with the advent of Christianity, you get that idea really emphasized in a new way. You get the idea that we all should be in solidarity with one another. The principle of solidarity in Catholic social thought. There's also the principle of subsidiarity, that in our public ethical life, things that can be done at lower levels should be done at lower levels. That doesn't mean everything can be done at a lower level. It doesn't mean there should be no federal government, for example, but it's a sort of kind of a presumption in favor of local social cooperation. But I'll just emphasize to round it out, Elijah. Look, ask if you're interested in miracles. Ask everybody you know about whether they've experienced miracles, insofar as that's something that's comfortable for you to do socially, and so on. Or read Keener's book or any of many other books on miracles, and see whether every single account of miracles you've ever heard seems to you implausible. And I'd also say, keep in mind, there's a big question. Well, what takes more faith, religious belief or atheism? It's a big question. You've got one life to lead. You can be agnostic and not take a position, but there are various reasons for and against that. But I'd encourage you to think about taking a position. And if you do that, you want to get an account of the origin of the universe. You want to get an account of whether miracles have happened, and if so, what their implications are. You want an account of the nature of consciousness. You want an account of whether we should be moral when nobody's looking. Okay, and you want an account of, say, the laws of physics. Why did things end up such that even though there's less than a 1 in a trillion chance of human beings like Elijah and myself us are being here to have a podcast, there's way less than a 1 in a trillion chance of that. Why did that happen? Was it just random, or was the universe set up to some extent, or to a large extent, for that to take place? So there's a whole lot to consider. I'd also recommend C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, which is I think, a great account of some of the central ideas of Christianity. And Elijah, thank you once again for having me on.
Yeah.